Today, I'm really pleased to be introducing Hallie Durchslag, who is speaking on the collective unconscious. Oh my God, okay. I'll pause again and do that again. Maybe they can even edit here so that I sound coherent on YouTube. We're very pleased to be presenting Hallie Durchslag today, who's speaking on the collective unconscious in the age of neuroscience, severe mental illness, and Jung in the 21st century. This is related to her book, which was published last year. Hallie Beth Durchslag lives in Cleveland Heights, Ohio, where she teaches and writes and maintains a private practice. She was a social worker in community development after earning an MS in social administration at Case Western in 1999. She received her PhD in clinical psychology at Pacifica in 2015. She has an abiding interest in the complexity of what makes us both human and transcendent beings. Her research has looked at this subject through the lens of severe mental illnesses and their physiological connection to Jungian theory. Her book, The Collective Unconscious in the Age of Neuroscience, Severe Mental Illness in Jung in the 21st Century, was released last year. She's curator of the Anima Mundi project, which is dedicated to soul-based approaches to holistic personal development and community building. And she's also past president and current board member of the Jung Educational Center in Cleveland. I'm excited by this. I was excited by Hallie's book, which I regard as wonderful. I'd also been reading Werther Kuster's recent book. He's a philosopher who has a history of schizophrenia, and his book, The Philosophy of Madness. And as I've been reading both of those books, which are considerably more imminent, much closer to experience than the long tradition of valorization, clarification of what psychosis really means, I know that I have really looked at my patients and myself rather differently. So I'm very grateful for this work and very pleased to introduce Hallie.
Well, thanks. Thank you so much. I was actually quite honored to receive this invitation. And I do want to thank Paul, Stefano, and Bernhard, not only for including me in the slate of discussion, but in the marathon of their efforts to maintain this fruitful endeavor. So thank you. What I'm hoping to outline today is a way into what I see as sort of two boxing matches in the post-Jungian community. And let's see if I can start my PowerPoint. The first tussle that I'm framing is with an outsider. It's between depth psychology and medical models of addressing psychological well-being. It's tough because a medical model is primarily a disease model, like in a classical sense. Something must be cured, made to disappear, like a surgeon cuts out a foreign object, or in this case, by medicating away. The medical model suggests the origins and presentation of severe mental illnesses are physiological in nature and are therefore primarily treated with psychopharmaceuticals. In the field of depth psychology, however, psychotic presentation presupposes a clinically and developmentally relevant fissure in the ability to integrate one field of experience with the other. So it's meant to be analyzed and processed, not medicated away. There's no doubt that trends in mental health treatment and modern psychiatry have increasingly decided that medication is magic. And yes, this puts a depth psychological model in a sort of struggle for survival within a behemoth industry, because medication seems to be supplanting the fruitful exploration of the psyche. Unfortunately, the efficacy of these drugs to successfully mediate symptoms also cannot be ignored. Herein lies the difficulty for psychoanalytic approaches in the age of neuroscience. course, I just got pollen in my eye, so apologies. The late David Treson saw this challenge almost 30 years ago, and in a 1996 article he published in the Journal of Analytical Psychology, he wrote, "A subject of ongoing debate is whether the clinical practice of depth psychology will or should continue to exist. It's my belief that a body of clinical theory that is in frank variance with how the brain works will not survive as a mainstream modality." Now, he wrote this article in the 1990s. Right around that time, it was a really influx of unprecedented research in biomedicine. And they've actually referred to this time period as the molecular medicine revolution. Technology allowing for the study of the active human brain, machines like EEGs and MRIs, contributed to the rise of the increasingly specialized fields of neuropsychology, genetics, neurobiology, which have now contributed vast amounts of research data. And depth psychology was able to have its own love affair with these scientific advances because studying the live brain allowed the ability to witness physiological responses to trauma and to renewed neural pathways through psychoanalytic work. And this pool of data lifted and buoyed the developmental school's treasure trove of confidence. But it has also been the root cause of a second tussle that sits deeper within our own field, and one that I had no idea even existed until I began my research in earnest 10 years ago. It's the dilemma surrounding a notion of a collective unconscious or objective psyche, the existence and passing of transcendent material within the human scope of experience that does not seem to be bound by time, location, epoch, or personal history. Depth psychology has become increasingly wary of hitching their wagons to the ephemeral nature of such a thing due to these same advances in neuroscientific research. And obviously, this backtrack is a big deal. A rejection of this psychic contributor reverses an initial split Jung made from Freud related to the existence of a personal as well as a collective unconscious, and it returns us to a unitary structure, one that might contain archetypal material, but only because of similarities in cognitive experiences or neurological developments molded through personal family systems and experience. Jung's theoretical models obviously ceased to be built upon after his death, and they have become fair game as far as the idea that his scientific understanding was limited by the times. That as we've come to know more, his work makes less sense. And when continued allegiance, I don't know if looking at George Hogenson's quote, oh shoot, I didn't put it in. So George Hogenson in that excerpt that I have on the screen talked about if we're going to still value Jung's work, it's probably because of a positive transference to him. So when allegiance to Jung's constructs is getting kind of tossed into the dustbin of a positive transference, we know we're kind of in trouble. It seems counterintuitive then perhaps that by looking at these scientific advances, especially advances within the realm of neuroscience, we can meet and allay these valid concerns. Surprisingly, considering the skepticism, Jung's work was actually heavily aligned to today's scientific discoveries about a unique physiological origin to severe mental illnesses like schizophrenia and bipolar I disorder. Jung made these links before scientific advances could support his theories, but now they do. I'm not really sure which of these tussles or boxing matches is more damaging to our survival, but both can be looked at from the lens of severe mental illness and should be looked at from the lens of severe mental illness. Why? First, this is the realm in which medical research has been building its treasure trove of data. And second, it is the ground floor of Jung's split from Freud and the creation of the collective unconscious. the entire a priori construct of an expansive metapsychic and shared repository was born out of a study of the unique nature of severe mental illnesses. So much so, Jung wrote, that the title of his definitive work, Symbols of Transformation, was, quote, misleading, for the book represents the analysis of prodromal schizophrenic condition. So even though depth psychology embraces certain scientific data I've highlighted, the medical field still remains kind of enemy number one. Unless you think I'm being a bit overdramatic, I'd like to offer an example. And this is a passage from a recent compendium on psychosis. It was published by Routledge in 2017. You can see edited by David Downing and John Mills. And this excerpt is John Mills writing in his chapter on psychosis, attachment, and trauma. And this excerpt is picking up on a thread which cites a correlation between psychosis and the biologic progressive interaction produced by attachment. So he's referencing biology here. Based in this, he states, this further challenges modern psychiatry and neuroscience with its emphasis on biological, chemical, and genetic essentialism as the culprit behind the etiology of psychosis. Here, neurobiology or genetic determinism undergirding psychosis theory must seriously contend with how attachment and cultural processes affect the development of psychotic organizations that are recalcitrant to materially reductive and simplistic models that prejudicially drive the education, training, and economics of psychiatry today. As long as the field of medicine continues to brainwash the public, healthcare providers, and insurance industries into believing that psychosis is only a genetic disease and only treatable by psychotropic medication, then the pharmaceutical and medical monopoly will only get richer, and those suffering from various forms of psychosis not helped by medication regimes will go unsuccessfully treated unless one is encouraged to enter psychotherapy. I'd like to unpack this a bit. The good news is that there's really not a disagreement about how to define psychosis across different fields. At a minimum, delusions or hallucinations are present. The capacity to recognize a consensual reality is impaired. The ability to appropriately link thoughts or object relations are distorted. The disagreements lay in its etiology and its treatment, but this is skewed because modern psychiatry and neuroscience do not pretend to know the etiology of psychosis. And psychosis in and of itself is not a diagnosis within a medical model. It's a descriptor that's used as part of a diagnostic tree. And this diagnostic tree is really the heart of the problem because the rest of the world is differentiating types of psychosis, and depth psychology is lagging in this regard. Why are we lagging? Probably because in this differentiation, medication reigns supreme in one, and psychoanalytic approaches reign supreme in another. I know that diagnostic manuals are kind of persona non grata in the Jungian community. They're dull, they're dry, they're stripped down, and skewed in many regards, but it's shocking to realize that there was no common language or pooled information prior to the mid-20th century, and no centralized pointers or shared framework. That needed to change, and it did, and those changes and that codification exist in some of these diagnostic guides. Now, in Europe, advances in codification is often attributed to Carl Jaspers, who was a German psychiatrist. His original publication, General Psychopathology, was widely used as a means of differentiating types of mental disorders. Phenomenological exploration of mental illness led Jasper to codify three major categories. We have cerebral illnesses, and then we have three major psychoses, which includes what we're talking about today, schizophrenia and manic depressive illnesses. And then a third and separate category were personality disorders, or psychopathian, as they were called. Jaspers wrote that these three psychotic disorders, quote, remain as the chief big problem for psychiatry, and to this group belong the vast majority of mental hospital patients. He found this grouping of illnesses unique from purely somatic disorders, but also distinct from personality disorders. Jaspers believed that although these disorders were not of an entirely somatic nature, quote, one must, however, assume that many of the psychoses have a somatic base which one day will be known, and that the hereditary link is a concrete reality. So across the pond, as they say, the United States was also moving toward a uniform nomenclature. And by mid-century, it's the common nomenclature still in use today, which is the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manuals of Mental Disorders. In the first edition, back in 1952, manic depression and schizophrenia were a part of a section on diseases of the psychobiologic unit. And then the second edition in 1968 discarded that term, but kept both manic depression and schizophrenia separated from neuroses and personality disorders, and linked them more closely with a listing of other brain disorders. And these crossover brain disorders are things like epilepsy. Jaspers put that in a different category, but Huntington's, Alzheimer's, changes due to traumatic brain injuries, all of which can produce psychosis. And there's been, 5 editions and 2 revisions over the past 60 years, many of which were meant to keep pace with the World Health Organization. Today, clues about onset and prevalence of schizophrenia and bipolar I disorder are vast, and genetic contributors cannot be ignored. Neither should attachment and cultural processes. But I hope I've planted that these seeds might belong in a different category. And depth psychology is in a unique position to assist with the differentiation of multiple aspects of psychological life and impairment. Without an appreciation of intrapsychic maturation and defensive strategies, the unconscious is way too easily dismissed, but we can't mix apples and oranges to do it. An insufficient rescue attempt, if I'm thinking about George Hoganson's word, the insufficient rescue attempt seems more related to glossing over the need for unique diagnosis and treatment in a young but burgeoning field of physiological disorders. It undermines the importance of unconscious processes in the end, because a one-size-fits-all in an increasingly nuanced landscape really does lose credibility. So I think my role here is because my personal history lays in the intersection of challenges I've just highlighted. Through my experience with bipolar I disorder, which is the category of bipolar disorders that includes full-blown mania and often psychosis, I know 2 things. First, I know what psychosis is and the storylines it forced on me. I know what a full-blown mania is about and what its messages are. I know that they are of a transporting nature, and they are a part of a world that has been empirically validated with themes of hero archetypes, apotheosis, cosmic conflict, and creation stories. And I also know that pharmaceutical medication has saved my life. And I don't say those words lightly, by the way. Bipolar I disorder has been ranked by the World Health Organization as one of the top 10 disabling disorders across the globe. And 15% of people who suffer from this form of disease die. That's 1 in 6 people. And the lethality of the disease increases with every episode someone has. Now, whether that's a physiological degeneration, like cartilage slowly disappearing from a once healthy knee, or whether it's just sheer exhaustion from a disruptive and painful life, regardless, if you have a 15% mortality rate, you've got a problem that needs to be solved. And I very easily could have been one of those mortalities. My first psychotic episode was when I was 18 years old. It's back in January of 1989. It took me another 4 years to be convinced that I had bipolar 1 disorder, but finally I started taking medication. At that time, it was lithium, which is still considered a gold standard. And then for the next 15 years, I tumbled along with the neurotic problems of finding meaning in my life. I mean, I turned 21, I turned 30. I was a young woman. I was doing young woman things. I did not understand what my role was in the mainstream narrative of life. I was trying to understand love and career and how I fit. I mean, these are the basic tasks, what we think about with individuation, now that I know that term. But when I fast forward, when I turned 33, a crisis of identity, which broke through in vivid dreaming that I had never experienced before, led me to seek psychotherapy again. So I made a call to the psychiatrist I see for medication management and asked if I could begin seeing her for therapy as well. And I told her of my dreaming, and she was not able to take on any therapy clients at that time. But she did have a referral for a psychologist who had an interest in dream work. And unbeknownst to me, that psychologist was a Jungian analyst. And so right around in 2004, I began an initial 2-year exploration of analytical psychology. So we have a very active Jungian community in Cleveland, a small town that we are. Over the years, we've hosted guests from James Hillman to James Hollis, Michael Conforti, Dennis Slattery, Paul Kugler, David Miller, Lionel Corbett, numerous speakers from the Interregional Society of Jungian Analysts across the United States. And during the time I became active in the lectures and classes, this is in 2004, there was nobody talking about medication. And I know this because my hand would always go up to ask the question, hey, what about medication? And the answer inevitably was that medication is a shortcut invented by the medical profession as a bypass for psychodynamic exploration. At best, it's a bridge until trauma is processed and someone can find their way to a stable enough ego to begin the real work. I ended up drinking that Kool-Aid. I decided probably that medication was a cheat. And so I chose to titrate off of my Lamictal, which was the mood stabilizer I had been taking for many years by that point. And this was in 2006. It was based in an attempt to nurture a connection to self that was not mediated by pharmaceuticals. It was supposed to be an exercise in increasing ego strength and purity of connection in order to serve the classical ideas of individuation. I felt the key to my development was not something to be medicated away, and the time of flying without a net was over. I just have a journal entry there. I actually even worked with the I Ching and had a reading with Stephen Karcher, who's a well-known scholar in the area. I really felt as though it was a precipice of transformation, like I was a butterfly that was about to burst out of its cocoon. So I began methodically lowering my dose of my Lamictal by about 25 milligrams a week. This was in concert with my psychiatrist, trying to figure out the safest way to do that. About 3 months later, my dose had fallen. So I had started at 400 milligrams. 3 months later, my dose had fallen below 50 milligrams. And 1 week later, from that benchmark, I was hospitalized. I was picked up by an ambulance while walking naked down a stretch of median on an interstate. And overall, I spent 5 of the next 7 weeks of my life hospitalized. I had not been hospitalized since the onset of my illness when I was 18, nor have I been hospitalized since then. Enter boxing match number 2. The negation of an a priori construct of a collective unconscious. Well, I can't imagine any definition so thoroughly picked through than a notion of archetype, where it resides, what it is, what Jung's inconsistencies were, the fallacies they perpetuate, the impossibility of his ideas. This deep dive into archetype has been used as the means of discrediting the broader notion of a collective unconscious. And that's unfair, because a desire to understand archetype began as a desire to know how a time-bound individual could possibly be experiencing an all-time vision, a channeling of a story that was seemingly repeated, epoch to epoch, culture to culture, stranger to stranger. Jung's explorations over his career of maybe, or perhaps, or it could follow that, has been challenged by the post-Jungian community as it cannot possibly. This is not a sound philosophical path, and there's no way. I'm going to borrow from my nieces, with kids around, someone says, no way, and they say, yeah, way. So yeah, there's a way. And it's not as though analytical psychology has abandoned an organizing principle that transcends any one individual and merges them into a collective of some sort. We can look anywhere in the content that the Jungian institutes are exploring, from major hubs to smaller markets, even in these Wednesday gatherings. Our field is looking at spirituality and notions of self, the Tao, the I Ching, tarot, astrology. None of these deny a totality that connects each of us to another in invisible but remarkable ways. Synchronicity, the blurring of time, chronicity, foreknowledge. I think I have time to share a story. This is in my book, but it just becomes increasingly bizarre to me. I don't, we have an international group. I'm not sure how many people, there's so much going on in the world. I don't know how many people are following the United States and our journey right now, but we're currently having hearings about an insurrection that happened at the foot of a past president of ours. And what's interesting about this path that the United States has gone on let me put it this way. So in 2006, I had my psychotic break, which I was descending for quite some time, from April to it was July, spent 7 of the next weeks in the hospital. The content of my delusions basically was that Black culture was going to experience a renaissance, a resurgence, that they were going to really make their mark in the world and take over what was basically a white hegemonic culture. And in these delusions, that white hegemonic culture was enforced by these alt-right militia groups. My journey was to kind of lead, whether it be as Athena or Artemis, was to lead innocents to safety during what was going to be a massive cosmic conflict of insane proportions to overthrow this government of white nationalists. In my psychosis, the efforts fail. And white nationalism reigns, and Black culture gets stymied again. The interesting thing about that is that I had these delusions in 2006, which was before Barack Obama was elected to the United States. It was before the rise of alt-right groups that are being explored today. I mean, we've always had racism in, the United States, so don't get me wrong, but it really experienced a resurgence after Barack Obama was elected. And where we stand right now is that we're fighting for our survival. So this all happened in 2006. Looking back from perspective, it feels difficult. It feels difficult to understand. If we look at notions of synchronicity and allow ourselves to take these further, and if we allow an objective psyche to exist, and if we allow kind of ourselves to walk the walk and talk the talk, then when we talk about synchronicity, which is the blurring of time, chronicity, foreknowledge, psychological states matching external experiences, it makes more sense in that context. In a 1931 essay, Jung described the collective unconscious as a collective human being combining characteristics of both sexes, transcending youth and age, birth and death, and from having at its command a human experience of 1 or 2 million years, practically immortal. If such a being existed, it would be exalted above all temporal change. The present would mean neither more nor less to it than any year in the 100th millennium before Christ. It would be a dreamer of age-old dreams, and owing to its limitless experience, an incomparable prognosticator. It would have lived countless times over and over again the life of the individual, of the family, the tribe, and the nation. And it would possess a living sense of rhythm, of growth, flowering, and decay. This is where we go. This is where people with schizophrenia and bipolar 1 disorder go. What I've placed on the screen here is a picture of the medication I take 2 times per day. It's 200 milligrams in the AM, 200 milligrams in the PM. It was the lone medication I took before my psychotic episode, and it's the medication I take now. One of the most difficult and interesting difficulties with my experience, and also I think for depth psychology, is that multiple layers of experience can be present at the same time. So it sets the stage for really big, important questions, like what is mine? What is a purely subjective co-opting of symbolic material through a collaboration with self, through our personal unconscious, through the dream editor that Whitmont talks about? It's really exciting stuff to grapple with. But the desire within the post-Jungian developmental schools is to make it all subjective, that we should no longer grapple with these difficulties because science has deemed it impossible. It's odd to me because for groups that love mystery, it does not seem we manage much of it. In denying that these connections can begin within our own physiology, in denying intrinsic body connections to things much larger than what we have metabolized thus far, we are robbing ourselves of material that can bring breadth and dimensionality to an understanding of who we are and where we stand. You know what? I'll end with this. Back in 2006, when I chose to discontinue my medication in service to individuation, I was forced into a very difficult relationship with Jungian theory. And what I've come to know now is that I'm actually in a difficult relationship with post-Jungian theory, that I feel pretty comfortable with the end of Carl Jung's legacy, but that the vast multifaceted taking up of his work since his death has been leaving me wondering what to do. Because like really, I have to fight for my own survival within the field if I'm not going to be pathologized. If I'm left to a subjective experience and a melding, a blurring of diagnostic differentiation, then the reason I went bananas and was hospitalized was because I just didn't have a sufficiently strong ego. Whether it's, from trauma or abuse or infantile fantasies related to a primitive fusion with a mother-child dyad. And this is a pretty fragile position to take, because if we're going to maintain that position, then we have to ignore an entire diagnostic category with 70 years of scientific data that needs to be shuttered away. And then even if it were true, we'd have to find a way to answer why my neurotic, but, pretty okay ego structure crumbled when medication was discontinued. And then why, after it was replaced, I pretty much went back to the pathology that I had of the past, And that brings us right back to where we started, which is some kind of struggle with pharmaceutical efficacy, because then we'd have to explore how it might be helpful with attachment issues as well. And I'm not there yet, and I'm a medication advocate. More importantly than my personal experience is as a clinician, because with this split, which I find, as I've said, a little bit willful, we end up robbing our clients because we're cutting off of a supply of knowledge and context that really leaves a kind of odd narcissism of personal responsibility in its wake. What are the clinical implications and challenges of openly allowing intrapsychic processes and transpersonal content to exist in parallel but intersecting paths? It's weighty, but it is our primary responsibility. So that's what I've got.
Thank you so much, Hallie. As much for your knowledge of the field as the passionate investment and the intensity of it, which is, and by the way, if just in Klammern in parentheses, I can say, I know my experience in the Jungian world so far has been a lot more varied. So if you're bumping into people who are certain of their position in regard to medication or psychosis, I've seen a lot of things, and I think a lot of my teachers are a bit more flexible. So perhaps people have other things.
I just want to challenge that for 1 minute. I'm so appreciative, and this is a really diverse field. So certainly I am mushing a very clear perspective in order to kind of make a point. So I'm very appreciative of that. But what I would say is, I've reviewed the literature. It's not just about attitudes.
Great.
It's what's being published. And really, when I was doing my research, I'm looking at journals of analytical psychology beginning in the 1990s and ending in the, mid-teens, mid-2010s. There's nothing. There's nothing. And the book that I just quoted was from 2017. So if there is a group that is feeling this way, I would say, go ahead and share.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But so
Maybe I've just seen it in different frames. I know that, for instance, my last analyst myself was Brian Stevenson, who is a psychiatrist in the NHS. So for him, medications are completely reasonable when they are useful, and also analysis is completely reasonable when it's possible. So thinking of many aspects to this, as I say, another aspect that had been very live for me in your book was bringing to life being in the psychotic world, which, even though we get a lot of abstract and symbolic sense of it from Jung's own writing, we tend not to enter it. And so the power of that, for me, as I'm saying, it seems to change my awareness of what's going on in analyses of various kinds. So any comment on that, or how you relate to your analyses, how it changes what you see? Do you see a bit beyond the everyday? Does that make sense as a question for Hallie? That was what I was.
That's to me.
I was throwing it at you. Throwing it at you.
I thought we were waiting to hear from everybody.
Well, we will, but I'm just wondering.
I think so first of all, yes, it absolutely has changed my relationship with the people that I work with in therapy, because one of the biggest now, I think, what needs to happen most is really strengthening that ego self axis, that gets spoken about. Because even as something really broad and transcendent, superpersonal, spiritual, religious is happening, we can also have magical thinking, and we can also fall in to some kind of overly aligned experience where now all of a sudden we don't have things to look at our personal intrapsychic level, that we don't have work to do as far as attachments, familial, stuff. So what happens is that therapy becomes helping the client sort through what are connections and what are defenses. So I think it's super important. What comes to mind, I just want to add this in, I loved the Psychosocial Wednesday that we had last time with Robin McCoy Brooks. She was talking about elitism, actually, right? And how we kind of, she was talking about elitism. And I just am wondering, and we don't have to answer this, but it's just kind of self-reflection about what kinds of clients people see in their practice, and whether they do use diagnostic categories. And if they don't use diagnostic categories, how do you accomplish that? Is it because you are private pay? Are you not going through insurance so that the record keeping is different and the necessity to kind of track treatment is different? That's okay, but if we're talking about what to do with severe mental illness and what to do with a very vulnerable population, I think we have to ask whether we're seeing them or not. So.
No, I understand that. I know that I don't myself have to classify analyses. I can do so, but even I think people in different countries may or may not have to follow a series of diagnostic categories. Yeah. And if so, those can, of course, be very partial, very sketched. This is just what I'm listing for this particular document. It wouldn't be intended to be the totality of the analysis. Other questions, other responses? I may keep talking if you don't mind. I'm thinking of, as I say, Wouter Custers. I've been reading his book, which is A Philosophy of Madness, in conjunction with yours. He is thinking differently. He's a professional philosopher trying to take apart psychosis in detail. And his condition is schizophrenia that comes and goes, and trying to look at that in great detail. Immensely powerful book. I love. He's being absolutely classical philosopher. He's taking apart detail by detail by detail in numbered sections. Quite wonderful. And the sheer visionary quality is amazing. The way he sees, the way when he's psychotic, the way he sees, the way he interprets, the way he understands. And as I say, even my own background was music and particularly sort of experimental arts. So the more transformed artistic form of this, but to really try to get inside it has slightly changed my point of view on everyone, right? Yeah. So thinking of how that impacts that.
You know what brings to mind, and it was, you bear with me for a few minutes, because I think this is one of the ways that we can try and understand this. And, you know, it's interesting, right? Because the mid-20th century, it was a huge, remarkable change point, both for Jung's focus and some of, you know, the post-Jungian focus. And Jung was expanding further and further outward into, you know, he was developing an interest in quantum physics. He was working with Pauli, you know, the Aranos conferences were really starting there. And, you know, he really was moving an initial notion of a personal kind of a collective unconscious into that non-localized realm of an objective psyche, you know, so he was examining a more fluid relationship with matter. And overall, the collective unconscious, which is an antiquated term, right, was becoming less and less situated in the human starry and farther away from kind of self-contained, subjectively active patterns, more towards a psychophysical whole, right? Where when I think of these disorders, when I think of these genetic predispositions, you know, when I think of bipolar disorder, I don't think of it as a mood disorder. Actually, I think of it as an energy disorder. I think that moods are connected to energy. So if you're very low energy, it sits very closely with depression. And if you've got high energy, you know, it can be very manic. I think that what happens is our permeability can change and our sensitivities have a range of experience. So, you know, what's her name? I'm not going to remember. There's a lot of data on the artistic temperament and things like bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. So if we think about it as a spectrum, that we all have a connection to, and this is kind of, you know, what astrology talks about, or what, you know, any of our kind of more esoteric Jungian interests talk about, is that if we're assuming that we have a connection to something bigger than ourselves, I think we also need to we also have to assume that sometimes that connection is not maintained well.
Mm-hmm.
Simply because of some kind of predisposition towards some kind of dysfunction. I mean, we don't all process sugar as well as we should. So we have all sorts of issues. And so if we think about these labels, which are going to change eventually, data is going to change. It's brand new, you know, I mean, it's only, gosh, if we had a medicine revolution in the 1990s, medication is really stagnant right now. It's really sad. It's a shame what's going on. But so we have to assume that things are going to change, but there's no reason to not assume that certain physiological characteristics alter a relationship with larger than self experiences. And there's nothing wrong with understanding that in order to be functional, you might need some help. And this is a bigger deal that, you know, like when I went to school at Pacifica, I'm in Ohio, in Cleveland, and I would have to take a red eye home from Los Angeles to Ohio, and I would have to spend a lot of time waiting at the airport, like at a Denny's or something, you know, kind of looking at the world outside. And I remember thinking, as I was watching all of the homeless people, lost people, you know, I was thinking, this is what happens. This is what happens when we don't value a container that can be helped by, you know. I would also say, just as I'm talking, I'm so American, you know, I'm clearly American biased. Not everybody has to deal with the DSM, and not everybody has to deal with our horrible insurance system. So yeah, recognizing the fact that I definitely am coming from a particular place.
No, I get it. And of course, people wrestle with different systems, but it will be this whole, I'm also making a bit of a congruency between some of the battles you're talking about, even metaphorically, between a culture that's not taking care of the homeless and as almost a parallel of, as I say, decades in the arts, and especially with the avant-garde types, with people who are making an absolutely clear decision between distinction between what they are and what that is.
Yeah.
Whether it's unconscious or psychosis or schizophrenia or anything, right?
Yeah.
Where a lot of artists just don't, right? And it can get complicated, but for me, it's easier that way almost.
Yeah. I don't know where I heard this quote by Salvador Dali. So don't hold me down. But the quote that I saw, Salvador Dali said, "I don't take drugs, I am drugs."
Yes.
And I think that there's a message in there. And I also think, you know, we're having kind of a new relationship with the transformational experiences that hallucinogenics can bring to people, and the healing notion and nature of those kinds of experiences. To me, that's just proof of medication there, because and the collective and the objective psyche, because if what we're saying is, hey, take this drug and you are going to, you know, reconnect with this amazingly transcendental place, we're already saying it. It's just that I think with some of these severe mental illnesses, you got to go the opposite direction. You got to say, whoa, come on. You go there enough. Let's bring you down, and let's keep you stable, and let's try to get you through a day-to-day living experience.
Understood. I have a couple of substantial questions, and if people don't mind, I'm going to allow ourselves to go over the hour. We often do. A question from Karen C. And this is a personal one, but it clearly really is close to the kind of work you're doing. How do you deal with the stigma of you sharing your diagnosis in your book, public forums and such, as a clinician or otherwise?
I don't really. Like, I can't believe I'm doing it, actually. And I've talked about this, you know, in some of my longer workshops. First of all, I don't bring it up in regular conversation. My good friends know that I've had trouble. It doesn't mean that my social circle, except the people that have seen me crazy, they know, you know, but it doesn't come up. And then, you know, it's an academic book that I wrote, so nobody really reads that. I actually feel a great deal of stigma in the community. That's part of the problem. And part of it is because as a clinician, you know, I'm going to judge somebody. I am. I'm going to judge the ability to manage countertransference. I'm going to judge whether you can hold a frame of what's yours, what's the client's. And there is a very glaring problem if you come out and say, hey, I have this really severe mental illness. It's a risk.
Sure.
Risk. And I feel most judged within our community. I can tell you that.
Okay. I'm sorry about that. I know that one of the women who studied with me in Zurich specializes in borderline personality disorder. And she did have arguments with all the other women. And she has pointed out quite casually, she was already working and specializing in this before she studied at the Institute. She's good at it. And she says, oh yeah, I'm pretty borderline. And that makes it easier for her. Now, this is a tough border to follow. I'm not saying everyone use it that way, but there's such power there, right?
Many of my clients know. There were clients who I had before the book, and so I felt obligated to tell them about it. And then also, I've got a website, and so it doesn't take long to find out that this is what's going on for me. I think that I'm pretty solid. I think that the dilemma for me gets that if there's a problem that I have, that I'm getting pigeonholed as borderline. Not that I'm trying to judge any difficulties that anybody has, but it's a difficult position to have to argue that I have a relatively good grasp of how to tolerate frustration, misunderstanding, rage, whatever it is, and I think that's the problem. We can't, it's two things and they interlap with one another. And wouldn't it be great if we just found out more?
Sure. Here's another response from Carolyn Bates. Hallie, thank you for such a transparent, courageous, and well-researched presentation. It really is. By the way, I'm an academic. I have way too much background in this. This is a really good book.
Thank you.
One of the challenges of the amorphous phenomenon that is analytical psychology theory may be a hubris that disallows the reality that we are biological beings and often at the mercy of neurotransmitter realities. So could you speak to the connections and defenses in the field itself, i.e., what you believe drives this denial/hubris?
Well, I hate to say, because you're so, we've got philosophers here, and philosophy is a really remarkable field, but I don't think we like religion. Not religion in a religious sense. I'm forgetting the quote that I want to find in my, listen, I don't think anybody likes the idea that there's things that we don't know about. And we are connected to an unbelievably rich and mysterious universe. And so I think whenever we have a chance to make a point that we're not on one hand, or that we can't be reduced on another, that we've got a dilemma. So we are both neurochemical creatures and we are beyond neurochemical creatures. I mean, the fact that one of the things about lithium lamictal, and one of the reasons I put it on the screen, we're all the same stuff. It's crazy. We have a difficulty with this, but it's looking at Neil deGrasse Tyson, I think, is a very, astrophysicist that's kind of busted through the mainstream lately. And just give me a second, because I think this is really cool. Oh, I didn't write it down. Most of the hydrogen in the world existed at the beginning of the world, so it's not and in a weird sort of way, atoms are archetypal. They like to meet for particular ways and connect with each other. And some of them want to become carbon and some of them want to become this or that. And we don't know why. Who knows why? So we're both from a micro and macro, what we are inside is what we are in a vast universe. I mean, we're just now seeing things that happened 5 billion years ago. So it's like, yeah, we can't be reduced, nor can we be limited. It would be nice if we could have limits on the unlimited,
Well,
that's what medication does. But I also think that's the problem that people have with acknowledging some of this stuff, is that then you have to not take a logos perspective and you have to take an anima, it's not logos. I don't think people love not using logos. That's what I would say.
okay. The whole idea that we don't know what we're doing, which I think was perfectly fine with Jung, and it tends to be fine with me, but I'm not sure it's fine with everybody.
And I think that he made a big mistake. This is not my idea. Cindy
Sure.
Porta, who's an analyst in New York, where she was talking about astrology, and she thought, that Jung caused a lot of his own problems because he was too tentative. So he was trying to find all the ways to talk about these really big things without quite talking about them. I mean, in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and his late thoughts, he said, or actually it was Aniela Yaffe who was summarizing his work, said, God and the unconscious were interchangeable. When Jung was talking about the collective unconscious, he kind of was talking about this bigger issue, but he just didn't want to do it. He didn't want to do it. And for good reason, because look at what we do. So he did cause a lot of his own problems just because he wanted to talk about something, but he wasn't going to really talk about something.
Okay, wonderful. Anyone else? I know, Barbara, you'd had a question. Has it already been asked, or what do you? I can. We haven't been unmuting people, but I will.
Yeah, I was thinking about Wouter Kusters in relationship to what Hallie is talking about, because Paul, you've mentioned Wouter Kusters, and Wouter Kusters, I've spoken with him
Wow.
at various times, and we have a little Jung club here in the Netherlands, and we invited him to speak about when the Red Book came out for Jung. We knew that Wouter Kusters had written his Yellow Book. So we invited him to talk about that. But what I was thinking about in terms of Wouter Kusters and Hallie was that I don't think Wouter Kusters, well, I know for sure that he's not going to be a therapist.
No.
Right. Well, see, Hallie is.
Yes.
And there's a big difference there. So I thought that might be, an important point to make. But of course, that was quite some time ago when we've been all talking a lot already. So that was what I was just going to mention.
Do you mind, Barbara, if you
Yes.
have any way of speaking to that as someone who's sort of looked at both of them? Can you tell me what you think the differences are? Because for me, I think the main connection I'm making, Hallie, is really looking at psychosis, not just through the artworks that I'm accustomed to in my professional life, but in a more immanent way. If it is the only thing you are seeing, experiencing, being, then it's different. So that's what I was picking up. But Barbara, you're seeing them as different. What, any easy thing to say about that? Or?
Well, so Wouter Kusters has also certainly had his psychoses. And but he's not, as far as I can see, he's not going to bring them to be a, let's say, an avenue for helping anybody else.
Right.
And I think that Hallie has done that.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Anyone else? Thank you all, and thank you, Hallie. And I have to say, I hope I don't sound too much like a therapist when I say thank you for the terrific courage, because the intense charge at one point, it was there and we can see it, and bless you for it. So, but that's another crossing of a line. I'm not a particularly religious person, but I'll say bless you, right? Okay.
I don't feel like you crossed the line. So
I hope that, I mean, one of the concerns is, you know, if something's very close to home, you want to make sure that there's a perspective that you're bringing. Again, you know, what we're talking about that doesn't feel like it's completely inundated with personal things. And I do hope that they didn't get muddied, even though it's a hard thing to do. And I'm very, very appreciative. Again, I want to thank, you know, I want to thank Stefano, Bernhard, and Paul. I mean, really, just I'm very grateful for the opportunity.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Hallie, for that courageous talk you gave us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you all for staying a bit overtime. Thank you for being here. Have a lovely summer. I will see you all in September. Take care, everyone.
Bye.